Inflation hurts everyone. But what if inflation is not just a mistake? What if governments actually benefit from it? So here's the question. If inflation makes ordinary people poorer, why do governments again and again create the conditions that allow it to happen? Why do they print more money when prices are already rising? Why do they spend beyond their means? Why do they keep repeating a pattern that history has exposed so many times before? This is the paradox. Governments speak about fighting inflation. They promise to control it. They warn about its dangers. And yet, throughout history, the state has often been one of inflation's greatest architects. Not always openly, not always deliberately, but often predictably. Because inflation is not just an economic accident. Sometimes it is a political tool, a fiscal shortcut, a silent way to move pain from the government's balance sheet into the pockets of the public. This is Hidden Pages, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand why governments allow inflation to happen, and why they sometimes benefit from it, we have to begin with a basic truth. States are expensive, they fight wars, they build armies, they fund pensions, they pay salaries, they rescue banks, they subsidize energy, they promise growth, they promise stability. And when those promises become too large to fund honestly, something has to give. Sometimes taxes rise, sometimes debt explodes, and sometimes the state reaches for the oldest financial trick in history. It changes the value of money itself. Long before modern central banks, long before digital banking, and long before economists turned inflation into charts and targets, rulers understood something simple. If you control the money, you can change the burden. In the Roman Empire, emperors faced the same problem governments face today. Too much military spending, too many obligations, not enough honest revenue. So they began to debase the coinage. Silver coins were gradually mixed with cheaper metals. The coins looked similar, they circulated the same, but their real value had changed. On paper, the state could still pay soldiers. On paper, it could still meet its obligations. But in reality, the money had been weakened. The public paid the difference. Prices rose, trust fell, and the empire bought time. That pattern never really disappeared. It only became more sophisticated. Because inflation, at its core, is not just rising prices. It is the dilution of purchasing power. It is what happens when more claims chase the same goods. And governments, more than almost anyone else, have the power to create those claims. They can borrow more, they can spend more, they can pressure central banks, they can expand the money supply indirectly. And when they do, the cost does not always show up immediately. That is what makes inflation politically useful. A tax increase is obvious. People see it, they resist it, they vote against it. But inflation is different. Inflation is a bill without an invoice. No one receives a letter saying, "We have decided to reduce the value of your salary, your savings, and your future purchasing power." It just happens. Quietly, gradually, then all at once. Your groceries cost more, your rent climbs, your savings buy less, your wages lag behind. And the state, meanwhile, gets room to breathe. This is the first secret of inflation. It acts like a hidden tax. Not because governments always design it as a conspiracy, but because when inflation rises, the public often absorbs costs that politicians could never openly impose. And that hidden tax becomes even more useful when governments are drowning in debt. This is the second secret. Inflation makes old debt easier to carry. Imagine a government that borrowed heavily years ago. The number on the debt stays the same. But if inflation rises, the real value of what must be repaid falls. The debt still exists. The bondholder is still owed money. But that money is now worth less. In other words, inflation does something remarkable. It allows governments to pay yesterday's promises with weaker money tomorrow. That is why heavily indebted states often fear deflation more than inflation. Deflation makes debt heavier, inflation makes it lighter. And once you see that, a lot of modern politics begins to make sense. Governments do not need inflation to become chaos. They do not want hyperinflation. They do not want wheelbarrows of cash or collapsing currencies. What they often prefer is something much more subtle. Moderate inflation. Inflation high enough to erode debt, high enough to lift nominal tax revenues, high enough to soften the real burden of obligations, but not so high that the public panics all at once. That is the ideal. A controlled fire. Difficult for households, useful for the state. And history is full of moments when governments chose exactly that path. One of the clearest examples comes from war. War is where inflation and state power meet most directly. Wars are expensive. Usually far more expensive than governments admit at the beginning. A war requires weapons, fuel, transport, logistics, wages, reconstruction, borrowing, and often years of obligations after the fighting ends. Very few governments can finance a major war purely through taxation. The political cost is too high. Raise taxes too aggressively and public support collapses. So states borrow. And when borrowing becomes too heavy, money expands. This is why inflation so often follows war. Not because war magically raises prices by itself, but because governments finance war through debt, monetary expansion, shortages, and supply disruption. The battlefield is physical. The inflation arrives later, at the supermarket, in the housing market, and the cost of living. The public pays for war long after the cannons fall silent. And war is only one example. Financial crises follow a similar pattern. When economies slow down, governments face enormous pressure. They are expected to stimulate growth, prevent unemployment, rescue failing banks, support households, stabilize markets. All of that costs money. And once again, honest financing becomes politically painful. So debt rises, central banks intervene, liquidity floods the system, asset prices inflate, consumer prices eventually follow. The language changes. The mechanism does not. It is still the same story. A state under pressure, too many promises, too little room, and money stretched to close the gap. This is why inflation is so rarely just a technical problem. It is almost always political. It reflects a choice about who should bear the cost. Should the government cut spending? Should taxes rise immediately? Should lenders take losses? Should voters feel pain now? Or should the pain be spread quietly across society through weaker money? Inflation is often the answer chosen when no politician wants to say the hard part out loud. Because inflation delays the reckoning. It does not erase the cost. It redistributes it, from the state to the public, from debtors to savers, from institutions with access to assets, to workers living on cash wages, and that redistribution is not equal. This is the third secret of inflation. Inflation punishes different people in different ways. If you own hard assets, real estate, stocks, or businesses, inflation may even help you. Your assets rise with prices, your debt becomes easier to repay. But if you live on wages, savings, or fixed income, inflation is brutal. Your paycheck adjusts slowly. Your rent does not. Your bank account loses value. Your purchasing power dies by increments. This is why inflation is not just an economic event. It is a class event. It changes who wins and who loses. And governments know this. Not always as a master plan. Not always as a dark secret discussed in a back room. But they know the arithmetic. They know debt can be inflated away. They know nominal revenues rise during inflation. They know the public blames companies, wars, shortages, foreigners, anyone, before fully blaming the structure of money itself. That ambiguity protects the state. And that is why inflation so often survives politically, even when it hurts economically. But there is a limit. History also shows what happens when governments push too far. In Weimar Germany, monetary expansion spiraled into collapse. In parts of Latin America, repeated inflation destroyed trust in the currency itself. In countless countries, people fled into gold, dollars, property, and anything that could hold value better than the national currency. Once the public stops trusting money, inflation stops being a policy advantage. It becomes a regime crisis. That is the line governments are always trying to avoid. They do not want the currency destroyed. They want the burden softened. They do not want panics. They want flexibility. They do not want to confess weakness. They want time. And that may be the most important point of all. Inflation is often less about greed than about time. Time to refinance. Time to avoid political backlash. Time to fund promises that cannot be funded honestly. Time to postpone choices no government wants to make. In that sense, inflation is not always the goal. Sometimes it is the side effect of buying time. But to the public, the result is the same. Savings shrink, costs rise, planning becomes harder, stability feels further away, and slowly, confidence begins to erode. That is why the real danger of inflation is not just higher prices. It is the corrosion of trust. Trust that money will hold value. Trust that work will be rewarded fairly. Trust that governments are managing the system rather than quietly feeding on it. Once that trust breaks, inflation becomes something more dangerous than an economic problem. It becomes a moral one. Because people stop asking, why is everything more expensive? And start asking, who decided this should happen? So if inflation hurts everyone, why do governments create it? Because inflation can finance what taxes cannot. Because it can lighten debt without declaring default. Because it can move pain silently across society. Because it can buy time in war, crisis, and political weakness. Because to the state, inflation is often easier than honesty. Not better, not fairer, not sustainable forever, just easier. And that is the uncomfortable truth. Inflation is rarely sold as policy. No government campaigns on making your savings worth less. But throughout history, when states run out of easy options, they return to the same instrument again and again. A weaker currency, higher prices, a quieter way to pay the bill. The public sees inflation as failure, and sometimes it is. But from the perspective of power, inflation can also be strategy. A hidden transfer, a delayed sacrifice, a tax collected without a vote. History shows this pattern clearly. Empires clipped coins, kingdoms debased silver. Modern states issue debt, expand money, and hope confidence lasts long enough. The methods change, the logic does not. Because in the end, inflation is not just about money. It is about who absorbs the cost of keeping the system alive. And as long as governments need to spend more than they can collect honestly, that question will never disappear. History hides the answers. I show you where to look.